There comes a point after 50 when financial mistakes stop being small. They don't always look dramatic. In fact, most of them don't look dangerous at all. That's what makes them dangerous. They appear reasonable, familiar, even responsible. And because of that, they continue quietly for years without being questioned. At this stage of life, time feels different. You no longer assume you have endless years to recover from poor decisions. You begin to notice how quickly a year passes, how fast opportunities disappear, how small patterns, repeated long enough, begin shaping outcomes you can no longer ignore. And that changes the weight of every decision. Not just the major ones, the small ones too. The habits you repeat automatically, the financial choices you stopped examining years ago because they became routine. That's where the real danger begins. Not in obvious failure, but in unconscious repetition. Because after 50, the greatest financial risks are often not reckless actions. They are comfortable actions, safe actions, predictable actions. The things you keep doing simply because you've always done them that way. You continue saving the same way, spending the same way, thinking the same way, believing the same things about money you believed 20 years ago. And slowly, without realizing it, your financial life stops moving forward. Not collapsing, just slowing. That's the part most people miss. Stagnation rarely feels urgent. It feels normal. You're still working, still managing your responsibilities, still staying careful. So naturally, you assume you're doing fine. But then something uncomfortable begins to happen. You look at where you are, and it doesn't match the effort you've put in. You've been disciplined, consistent, responsible, yet something feels incomplete, as though time has passed faster than progress. And once that feeling appears, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because deep down, you begin asking a question most people avoid. What if the things I believed were helping me are actually holding me back? That question changes everything. Because it forces awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable at first. It makes you notice the patterns you once ignored, where fear disguised itself as caution, where routine replaced growth, where safety slowly turned into limitation. Most people never reach this point. They continue doing what feels familiar because familiarity feels secure. They tell themselves things will improve eventually, that more time will solve what better decisions never addressed. But time does not automatically improve your position. It magnifies your direction. If your direction is limited, time strengthens that limitation. If your direction is clear, time strengthens that progress. That's why these mistakes matter so much after 50. Because recovery becomes slower, the margin for error becomes smaller, and the cost of repeating the wrong patterns becomes greater every year they continue. But here's what matters most. Awareness changes everything. The moment you clearly recognize what's working against you, you gain the ability to adjust it. Not through panic, not through reckless decisions, but through deliberate change, small shifts in thinking, small shifts in behavior, small shifts in how you approach money, opportunity, risk, and time. And over time, those shifts begin to compound. Because just as bad habits slowly build financial pressure, better habits slowly build financial strength. That's why this is not about fear. It's about clarity, about seeing what most people overlook until it becomes too late to correct easily. And once you see it clearly, you arrive at a decision point. You can continue repeating the same patterns, or you can begin moving differently, more intentionally, more consciously, more strategically than before. Because after 50, success is no longer about working harder. It's about thinking more clearly. And the people who recognize that in time often change their future completely. There is a shift that occurs gradually in many men as the years advance, and because it happens slowly, it is rarely recognized while it is taking place. It does not begin with failure nor with loss. It begins with experience. A man passes through years of work, responsibility, achievement, and disappointment. He learns caution through difficulty. He learns restraint through consequence. And over time, these lessons begin to reshape the way he thinks. In earlier years, his attention is directed toward increase. He seeks opportunity. He pursues advancement. He is willing to move into uncertainty because he believes the future can become greater than the present. But after 50, something often changes. The focus begins to shift away from expansion and toward protection. At first, this appears wise. A man tells himself he must now be careful. He believes preserving what he has is more important than building more. He begins avoiding what feels uncertain. He chooses what feels safe, stable, and familiar. And because these decisions appear responsible, they are rarely questioned. Yet beneath this caution lies the first dangerous mistake: excessive protection. Protection in itself is not wrong. Every man must preserve what he has built. But when protection becomes the primary goal, growth begins to weaken. The individual continues managing his life carefully, yet forward movement slows. He remains stable, but he no longer advances. This does not happen dramatically. It happens gradually, through repeated cautious decisions that reinforce one another. Each avoided opportunity strengthens the next avoidance. Each movement toward comfort increases resistance to uncertainty. Over time, the pattern becomes fixed. Many men reach this condition without realizing it. They continue doing what feels sensible. They avoid obvious risks. They maintain order. Yet years pass, and little changes. They preserve their position, but they did not improve it. And eventually, they begin to feel something difficult to explain. A quiet awareness that time has moved faster than progress. That realization is painful because it conflicts with effort. The man has worked. He has remained disciplined. Yet the outcome does not fully reflect the energy he invested. If I were beginning again, I would recognize this pattern early. I would understand that protection and growth must exist together. One preserves the present. The other secures the future. Without growth, protection eventually becomes confinement. A man begins holding his position so tightly that he prevents himself from moving beyond it. There are individuals who continue to advance after 50, not because they abandon caution, but because they refuse to let caution dominate their thinking. They remain deliberate, but they continue positioning themselves where growth is possible. They understand that experience is not meant to reduce movement. It is meant to refine it. Such people are often perceived differently by others. They appear calm, composed, and forward-moving. They are not reckless, but neither are they withdrawn. They continue building while others merely maintain. And because of this, opportunities continue appearing around them. This leads to the second dangerous mistake: repeating old financial habits without questioning whether they still work. There is a tendency in every man to rely upon what produced results in the past. Habit creates efficiency. Once a method appears reliable, it becomes automatic. And in earlier years, this repetition can be useful. It creates discipline and consistency. But conditions change, markets change, opportunities change, the world changes. And habits that once created advancement may eventually create stagnation if they are never adjusted. A man may continue saving in the exact same way he did 20 years earlier. He may continue directing money according to patterns that were formed under completely different conditions. Because the habits feel familiar, he assumes they remain effective. Yet familiarity is not proof of usefulness. A pattern can continue long after its value has diminished. This is where many become trapped. They mistake repetition for progress. They assume that because something once worked, it will continue producing the same outcome indefinitely. But repeating what once worked is not the same as repeating what still works. That difference is critical. Consider the individual who learned early in life to save carefully. That habit protected him from waste. It created discipline. But if that same habit never evolves beyond preservation, it may eventually limit him. He continues saving, yet the savings are never directed toward growth. The habit remains, but the outcome stagnates. The same is true of avoidance. A man who once protected himself from unnecessary risk may later avoid every opportunity that requires movement. The original habit was useful. The unexamined continuation of it becomes limiting. If I were beginning again, I would examine every repeated financial pattern. I would ask not whether it feels familiar, but whether it still leads forward, because habits must evolve if results are to evolve. The man who continues refining his methods remains adaptable. The man who repeats without examination eventually becomes rigid. And rigidity, after 50, becomes dangerous because it limits the ability to respond to changing conditions. There is also a deeper issue hidden within these habits. Familiarity creates emotional comfort. A man begins trusting what he already knows more than what he has not yet explored. He becomes less willing to question long-standing assumptions. And over time, his financial life becomes less intentional and more automatic. Decisions are no longer made consciously. They are repeated unconsciously. That is where awareness becomes essential. Because awareness interrupts automatic behavior. It forces examination. It reveals where actions are being guided by old assumptions rather than present reality. Many avoid this process because it creates discomfort. To question a long-standing pattern is to question a part of your identity. Yet without that examination, growth remains limited. There is another dangerous mistake that becomes increasingly common after 50: misunderstanding risk entirely. Many men begin believing that avoiding all uncertainty is the same as being financially responsible. They conclude that stillness equals safety. And because this belief feels reasonable, it becomes deeply rooted. Yet avoiding all risk often creates a greater danger than risk itself. Risk is not the true threat. Ignorance is. Thoughtless action creates danger, but thoughtful movement creates possibility. A man who avoids every uncertain opportunity eventually limits himself to what already exists. He preserves the present, but prevents the future from expanding. This misunderstanding develops slowly. Experience with loss increases caution. Responsibility increases hesitation. The desire to avoid mistakes becomes stronger than the desire to create progress. And gradually, movement stops. The individual no longer asks what can be gained. He asks only what might be lost. That shift changes everything. There are many who appear financially safe from the outside, yet internally, their position weakens over time because nothing new is being built. They remain where they are while costs rise, opportunities shift, and time continues moving forward. This is not dramatic decline. It is quiet limitation. In contrast, there are those who approach uncertainty differently. They do not seek reckless risk. They seek informed movement. They examine opportunities carefully. They ask what can be understood, controlled, and directed. And because they continue moving thoughtfully, growth remains possible even later in life. If I were beginning again, I would redefine safety completely. I would understand that true security is not found in standing still, but in continuing to move intelligently. Because after 50, the greatest danger is often not taking a thoughtful step forward. It is remaining frozen while time keeps moving without you. There is another mistake that becomes increasingly dangerous after 50, and it is rarely recognized while it is happening. It is the belief that time itself will eventually improve your financial condition. A man tells himself that if he continues working, remains patient, and avoids major errors, things will naturally become better over time. This belief feels comforting because it removes urgency. It allows him to continue without deeply examining whether his direction is actually leading anywhere different. In earlier years, this assumption appears true. A man works steadily, gains experience, and gradually increases his income. Progress seems automatic. Time appears to reward consistency. From this, he forms an unconscious conclusion that continuing the same pattern will eventually produce a stronger future. Yet, what he fails to notice is that time itself does not create progress. Time magnifies direction. If the direction is weak, time strengthens weakness. If the direction is strong, time strengthens progress. This is where many become trapped after 50. They continue repeating patterns that once produced small advancement, assuming those same patterns will continue producing larger results indefinitely. But repetition without adjustment eventually creates stagnation. The man works, earns, manages, and maintains. Yet the years pass faster than his progress expands. The danger is subtle because there is no immediate collapse. The individual continues functioning normally. Bills are paid. Responsibilities are handled. Life remains stable. Yet internally, something begins to feel misaligned. The future no longer appears as secure as it once did. The distance between where he is and where he expected to be slowly becomes visible. And because enough time has passed, that realization carries emotional weight. Many respond to this realization by waiting longer. They tell themselves they simply need more time. But more time applied to the same direction only deepens the same result. That is the critical truth most people avoid. Time does not correct patterns. It reinforces them. If a man continues operating the same way for another decade, the outcome will likely become a larger version of the current condition, not a different one. If I were beginning again, I would stop relying on time alone. I would begin directing it deliberately, because directed time produces growth, while passive time produces repetition. This leads to a major distinction between those who continue advancing after 50 and those who remain stagnant. One group waits for improvement. The other constructs it intentionally. The men who continue building later in life do not drift through time unconsciously. They become deliberate with how their years are used. They begin asking different questions, not "how long do I have left?" but "how effectively am I using what remains?" That shift changes everything. Because once urgency becomes intentional instead of emotional, action becomes more focused. Such individuals often appear different to others. They are not rushed, yet they are never passive. Their movements are measured, their decisions deliberate, their attention directed toward what produces long-term effect rather than temporary comfort. Others sense this quality immediately. It creates the impression of clarity and control. There is also another dangerous mistake after 50 that few discuss openly, believing that income alone creates financial strength. Many men spend decades focused entirely on earning, and earning is important. But income by itself does not create wealth. It creates opportunity. What matters is what happens after the income is received. A man may increase his earnings repeatedly over the years and still fail to improve his financial position meaningfully. Why? Because money that is not directed simply moves through life instead of building beyond it. Expenses rise alongside income. Lifestyle expands alongside earnings. Immediate needs consume future potential. And without realizing it, the individual remains trapped in a cycle that creates continuation instead of accumulation. This is why some people earn large amounts for years and still feel financially uncertain later in life. The issue was never income alone. The issue was the absence of structure and direction around that income. If I were beginning again, I would stop asking only how much I earn. I would ask how much of what I earn is building something beyond my immediate life. There is a major difference between maintenance and expansion. Maintenance keeps your current position stable. Expansion increases your future possibilities. Most people after 50 focus almost entirely on maintenance. They preserve their current lifestyle, protect existing assets, and avoid disruption. But if expansion disappears completely, the future slowly becomes narrower. This narrowing often happens invisibly. Opportunities decrease, flexibility decreases, financial resilience weakens, and because the changes are gradual, they are rarely addressed early enough. That is why awareness becomes essential. Because once you recognize the pattern, you regain the ability to interrupt it. There is also another mistake hidden beneath many financial struggles after 50, the refusal to adapt mentally. A man may continue operating according to assumptions formed decades earlier, even though conditions have changed completely. He trusts old patterns simply because they once worked. But the world does not remain fixed. Economies shift. Technology changes, financial systems evolve, opportunities move. The individual who refuses to adapt eventually becomes disconnected from the environment around him, not because he lacks intelligence, but because he stopped examining whether his thinking still fits current reality. This creates stagnation disguised as stability. In contrast, those who continue advancing remain mentally flexible. They refine their approach continuously. They question old assumptions. They adjust their methods without abandoning discipline. And because they remain adaptable, They continue finding movement where others see limitation. If I were beginning again, I would examine my thinking regularly. I would ask whether my financial habits are aligned with the world as it exists now or only with the world I once understood. Because refusing to evolve financially after 50 is extremely dangerous. The world changes regardless of whether your thinking changes with it. There is also a psychological shift that becomes necessary later in life. Many begin seeing themselves primarily as protectors of what they already have rather than builders of what is still possible. That identity quietly changes behavior. It reduces initiative. It lowers ambition. It narrows perspective. And eventually, it convinces the individual that expansion is no longer realistic. But this belief is false. Growth does not belong only to youth. Clarity often belongs to age. Experience creates precision. Discipline creates focus. And when those qualities are directed properly, significant advancement remains possible even later in life. The issue is not age itself. The issue is whether the individual continues positioning himself for movement or unconsciously retreats into comfort. There is also a final dangerous mistake that ties all the others together: living financially on autopilot. This happens when years of repetition remove conscious awareness from decision-making. A man stops questioning his patterns. He stops evaluating his direction. He simply continues because continuing feels normal. And this is perhaps the greatest danger of all, not dramatic failure, but unconscious continuation. Because unconscious continuation slowly compounds into outcomes that become increasingly difficult to change later. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say this: never allow familiarity to replace awareness. Examine your direction continuously. Adjust when necessary. Remain willing to move, refine, and grow. Fix this deeply within your mind. I do not drift through time unconsciously. I direct my future intentionally. Because the moment a man begins living with that level of awareness, his financial life changes completely. He stops reacting automatically. He stops repeating blindly. And instead, he begins building deliberately with the years he still has ahead of him. In the end, most financial mistakes after 50 are not caused by recklessness. They are caused by unconscious repetition, by continuing patterns that once felt safe, long after they stopped being effective. That is why these mistakes are so dangerous. Not because they destroy everything immediately, but because they slowly shape the future without being noticed. A man continues working, continues earning, continues managing life the same way he always has. And because nothing appears broken, nothing changes. Years pass quietly. Then one day, he looks at where he is and realizes the progress never became what he expected. That realization is painful because effort was real. The discipline was real. The responsibility was real. Yet the outcome still feels incomplete. And once that awareness appears, two paths become possible. One path leads deeper into denial. A man tells himself it is too late to change. He continues repeating familiar habits because they feel comfortable. He avoids examining difficult truths because discomfort feels threatening. And over time, his world becomes smaller, not suddenly, but gradually. The other path is different. A man accepts the truth honestly. He recognizes that some of his long-held financial habits may no longer serve him. He understands that caution without growth creates stagnation. He realizes that time alone will not improve his position unless his direction changes. And because he recognizes this, he begins moving differently, more consciously, more intentionally, more strategically. That is where transformation begins. Not through panic, not through extreme action, but through awareness followed by consistent adjustment. Small changes in thinking. Small changes in behavior. Small changes in how money is viewed, directed, and used. Over time, those changes compound. That word matters, compound. Because financial decline compounds quietly, but financial strength compounds quietly too. The direction simply depends on which patterns are repeated long enough. This is why awareness after 50 is so powerful. At this stage of life, clarity becomes more valuable than speed. you begin seeing what truly matters. You begin understanding the difference between movement and progress. You begin recognizing where fear disguised itself as responsibility, and where comfort quietly became limitation. And once you see those things clearly, you gain the ability to change them. That is the hidden advantage many people overlook later in life. Experience. Experience gives perspective. Perspective sharpens judgment. And sharp judgment, when combined with deliberate action, can still create extraordinary change. The future is not decided simply because time has passed. It is shaped by direction. There are people who continue drifting financially for the next 20 years. And there are people who completely reshape their future in 5. The difference is rarely intelligence. It is awareness. One continues unconsciously. The other begins acting deliberately. If I were to express this as a principle, it would be this: do not allow caution to become confinement. Do not allow familiarity to become stagnation. And do not assume that repeating the same financial patterns will eventually create a different future. Fix this firmly within your mind. I remain aware. I continue adapting. I continue building. Because the moment a man stops drifting and begins directing his financial life intentionally, everything changes. His decisions improve. His confidence strengthens. His opportunities expand. And most importantly, his future no longer feels uncertain and accidental. It becomes deliberate. That is the real goal after 50. Not simply surviving financially, not merely avoiding mistakes, but creating enough clarity, direction, and control to move through the next stage of life with confidence instead of fear. And for the people willing to examine their patterns honestly, that future is still completely possible.